The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 16th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The Gospel of the Lord. So last week in the sermon, I pointed out that Matthew had used a word that appeared nowhere else in his Gospel. And today, Matthew did it again. Actually, it's a word that appears twice in Matthew's Gospel, but is never, ever used in any of the other Gospels. It is the word church. And while the word church and churches appear in many New Testament documents later on, the word church appears only here and in the 18th chapter of Matthew when Jesus speaks about resolving conflict with one another. Church is an unusual word in the Gospels, but it's not an unusual word for us, and that's because, hey, we're all sitting in church. And indeed, even among people in our society who are not now and have never been Christians, church isn't one of those deep theological terms that we need to explain. Or is it? Indeed, when a word that's unusual for the Gospels has become common for us, we ought to stop for a moment and ask ourselves if we're using the word in the same way that the Gospels use it. And in fact, we use the word church to mean a variety of things. We use it in different ways. Sometimes we use the church to mean, or we use the word church to mean organization or structure. So as part of helping out and putting together the Interfaith 5K for next weekend, we are helping deal with the money and all kinds of things, so we have had to provide a number of banks and organizations with the church's federal tax ID number. And there are a lot of times when church means an official 501c3 organization that forms a legal identity. And we've had checks come in from different congregations where it actually says something like St. John's by the gas station, comma, Incorporated on the check. And I think that's really weird. It just feels weird. And we never, ever do that at Prince of Peace. But in fact, Prince of Peace Lutheran Church is a nonprofit corporation of the state of Maryland, and we have a tax-exempt number, and we have a federal tax ID 501c3 number. And sometimes when we use the word church and people ask us what is the church's tax ID number, we mean the organization or the structure when we use that word. Sometimes we use the word church to mean programs or activities. So anytime you say, "Hey, I'm going to go to church this morning," or "I'm going to church this evening," I mean, it may imply that you're coming here to this building, but it probably more likely means that you are coming to worship, or to a class, or to a book group or activity, or to some kind of meeting. Church can sometimes mean an event, and often does. We are going to this event. And of course, sometimes the church means the building. Especially if you have been involved in caring for the property, we often speak of things like the church needs to be cleaned, or the church needs to be repaired, the very things that Joan and Jennifer were talking about in the video, and those things are almost always true. And indeed, that's why we're focusing the God's Work Our Hands Sunday on some of those things. But when we speak like that, we use the word church to mean building, and sometimes more generally, the property. All of those are perfectly okay ways to use the word church. But that is not what the word means when Jesus uses it in the Gospels. It's not even what church meant when it's used later on in the New Testament. Indeed, until the 3rd century, it was rare for Christians to have a dedicated building, which they called church. And often, Christian communities had no legal standing whatsoever. And so it's helpful to remember when the word church unusually appears in today's gospel reading, to remember that the Greek word that we translate as church is ekklesia, from which we also get the English word ecclesiastical, which is a big churchy term and about church stuff. But the Greek word actually means community. It's the community of those called out of the world or called together in order to be the community of Jesus. And that's what Jesus is talking about in today's gospel reading. It's the experience and reality of Jesus as Son of God and Messiah, which is the rock on which the community is formed, drawn together, and sustained. Church is, from beginning to end, supposed to be the community of Jesus in the world. And that's the same definition of church that's used throughout the New Testament. Whenever you read anybody who says, I'm writing to the church in wherever it is, they are not writing to a building. They are writing to probably a very small group of people who clearly probably do not own a building and who definitely do not have a 501c3 federal tax ID number. Church means the community of Jesus, those called out from the world and called together by the Holy Spirit to be the body of Christ in the world around them. That's the first and most basic definition, and it's important to keep that definition in mind, especially when we use church in all of those other ways. Indeed, as things change drastically and rapidly around us, it's all the more important to remember that our identity as church is grounded in being community in Jesus. And it's important to consider what that means whenever we use the word church to mean the organization or the structure. I mean, sometimes we get tied to the way we have always done things and organized ourselves. It's just sort of the default way. But is the structure and the way we've organized ourselves sustaining us as community, helping us to grow and nurture us as community, or is it making life more difficult? And do the rules keep people away? You know, when I was growing up and for a long time afterward, the rules usually required that people show up in person if they wanted their participation to be counted. And in person is actually vital because it helps us build community with each other. But we have learned over the last number of years that when we're allowing people to participate online in things, it makes people more able to actually participate. It helps people stay connected to community. I mean, right now, one of the Social Justice Committee that's organizing a lot of the God's Work Our Hands and some of these other things, they have been meeting online all the time when they have their meetings. And there are folks on that group that say, this is great because I am out of town so much, I'm not around. If I couldn't meet online, I couldn't be part of this group and I couldn't help out and be connected. It's been a great way, and we found the same thing for annual meetings, when people are able to connect in even if they are someplace else at that time. They're able to ask questions, they're able to listen in, they're able to be part of community. Sometimes the structure has to be something that helps community develop, not just do things the way we've always done them. It's important to remember that basic definition of church as community whenever it is that we're thinking about programs or activities. You know, when I was growing up and for a long time afterwards, programs like, you know, confirmation, Sunday school, choirs, Bible studies, youth groups, all that kind of stuff, those were the vehicles by which you nurtured, sustained, and built community. And it was great if those programs were working. But for many of those programs, fewer people participate now. And often, when we start discussing that, we get stuck in this, how can we make that program work again? But sometimes the answer is to try something else or to look for a new way of doing things. Because building and sustaining community in Jesus is the thing that's vital, not necessarily continuing a program that used to serve that goal, but maybe doesn't anymore. And it's important to remember church as community, as that basic definition, especially when we use the word church to mean the building. You know, whenever I've been involved in a building addition or a building renovation, we have always remembered at the dedication that the church building is the house of the church. This is the place where the community gathers. It's the place where the community is sustained in faith. It's the place which can serve as a mission outpost to others and help bring healing and hope in the community. It's the reason that we spent a lot of time and effort in the last couple of years developing the patio courtyard area out there. It really has nurtured and developed our community here, and it's been a great event. It's been a great place to help nurture community with the NA groups that use it, when we had Juneteenth and all kinds of other congregations could gather together. It's a different way of thinking about property than we used to when we simply thought about how can we build bigger or greater sanctuaries or classroom buildings or things like that. But it's a way of thinking about how does the church building actually nurture and sustain community. You know, more and more, as the world changes around us, we need to keep in mind what church really means. Because from the beginning, Jesus used this term to mean a community called together to be his body in the world. And that community can and has functioned without structures, programs, and even buildings. And while I think that we will have those things for the foreseeable future here, it's important to constantly and continually ask ourselves if our structures and programs and building are sustaining community in Jesus. And if not, what do we do about it? Because in the end, the church, as the Gospels point out, is Jesus' idea, not ours. And Jesus intends this church to be a community in which we grow and develop more deeply in our relationship with Jesus, in which we help one another in living lives of faith and service, and through which we invite others to experience the living presence of Jesus as well.